The river was wrong that morning. Zinnia noticed it before she saw anything else, the current pulling south when it should have been pulling east. The water the color of old pewter instead of the blue-gray she'd known her whole life. She stood on the porch of her father's homestead with a tin cup going cold in her hands, watching the bend where the Callaway River disappeared into the Douglas firs, and she felt the wrongness the way you feel a storm before the clouds arrive. In your teeth, in the backs of your hands. She went inside and put the cup down and picked up the rifle. Her father had been dead 11 months. She had not left the homestead in 4. That was not by choice, exactly. It was more that the homestead needed her, the chickens, the 2 remaining goats, the winter stores that had to be checked for rot every 3rd day, because the root cellar had flooded in October and never fully dried. There was always something, and leaving meant walking the 12 miles to Dunmore and facing the questions she didn't have answers to yet. Questions about the deed, about the taxes, about what a woman alone was supposed to do with 40 acres of timberland and a roof that leaked in 3 places. She had been putting those questions off. The rifle was her father's, a Winchester that he'd carried from Missouri, and oiled every Sunday morning like a religious act. She knew its weight the way she knew her own hands. She carried it to the window and looked out at the tree line and saw nothing, just the Douglas firs standing dark and straight in the November light, their tops swaying in a wind she couldn't feel from inside. She set the rifle against the wall and went back to her chores. The men came at midday. There were 3 of them. She heard the horses first. The particular crack of frozen mud under hooves, a sound different from the deer that sometimes wandered the Northfield, different from the wind, working at the corner post of the barn. She was in the barn when she heard it, pitching old straw into the corner, because one of the goats had gone lame, and she wanted clean bedding under it. She stopped, listened. 3 horses, moving slow and deliberate, the way men move when they don't need to hurry because they already know what they're going to find. She left the pitchfork against the wall and went to the barn door, and looked through the gap in the boards. They were coming up from the river path. Not the road, not the way honest visitors came. One wore a yellow canvas coat so dirty, had gone nearly brown. One was broad across the shoulders, with a close-cropped beard, the color of dried blood. The third was thin, almost elegant, in a black coat that was too clean for the terrain, which meant he hadn't been traveling long, which meant he'd come from somewhere close. Zinnia recognized none of them. What she recognized was how they were looking at the house, not the way people look at a place they're visiting, the way they look at something they've already decided belongs to them. She did not run back to the house. Running would make noise, and noise would tell them where she was. She pressed herself flat against the inside wall of the barn and breathed slow and thought. The rifle was in the house. She had the pitchfork. She had a skinning knife on her belt. And her father had always said a knife was only useful in a fight if you were willing to get close enough to use it, and to accept that the other person was going to be close enough to use theirs. She heard them dismount, heard the elegant man say something to the other 2, in a low voice she couldn't make out. Then she heard her front door open. Not a knock, not a call, just the latch and the creak of the hinges and the sound of boots on her floor and the silence that followed. She picked up the pitchfork. There was a moment, just a moment, where she thought about staying in the barn, waiting them out. Maybe they'd take what they wanted and leave. Maybe they'd take the food stores and the tools and the 2 chickens and go. She stood there, holding that thought the way you hold a stone, feeling its weight. And then she thought about the deed to the property folded inside the tobacco tin on the mantel, and she pushed the barn door open and walked into the yard. The broad man, red beard, she had already started calling him in her head, because she had no other name for him, was standing by the porch steps. He saw her come out of the barn, and he smiled, and the smile was worse than if he hadn't smiled at all. There she is, he said. You're in my house, Zinnia said. Her voice came out flat, which surprised her. She had expected it to shake. Your house, he said it. Like it was a question he found amusing. My house, my land. I'll ask you once to take your friends and get back on the river path. The thin man appeared in the doorway. He had found the tin on the mantel. She could see it in his hand, open, the deed half unfolded. Her stomach turned to cold water. Silas Croft filed on this land 6 weeks ago, the thin man said. His voice was pleasant. That was the worst part. He has the county registration to prove it. You're living on disputed property. My father homesteaded this land 18 years ago. There is nothing disputed about it. Your father is dead. He said it without malice, which made it worse. Just a fact. A convenient fact. And there's no record of transfer. There doesn't need to be a record of transfer. It passes to his heir. You'd need a lawyer to make that argument. He tilted his head. You have a lawyer? She tightened her hands on the pitchfork. The third man, yellow canvas, had drifted to her left, away from the porch, moving with the casual patience of someone who did this regularly. He was cutting off her angle to the door. She watched him without looking directly at him. I'll say it again, she said. Get off my land. Redbeard took one step toward her. She swung. The pitchfork caught him across the forearm, not the tines, the handle, because she'd had a half-second to pull the blow when she saw how big he actually was up close. It was enough. He swore and grabbed for it, and she wrenched it back and stepped to the side, away from yellow canvas, trying to keep space between herself and all three of them at once, which was impossible. She knew it was impossible, but she kept moving anyway, because standing still was death, and moving was at least a problem they'd have to solve. Redbeard came at her again. She jabbed with the tines this time, low, and he dodged back, and his expression changed, the amusement gone, something harder and colder in its place. The thin man stepped down from the porch. Yellow canvas moved in from her left. She thought, this is where it ends. And then a sound came from the tree line. Not a voice, not a warning shot, just the sound of something very large moving through the underbrush at a speed that nothing that large should move. And then the tree line was not just trees anymore. There was a shape itself as it crossed the open ground of the north field, and the shape was a man, except the word man felt inadequate for what she was seeing. He was enormous. Not in the way of a large man. She had known large men, had grown up around loggers and trappers and river workers, but in the way of something that had spent so long in wilderness that it had taken on the character of the landscape itself. His coat was elk hide, she thought, though it was hard to be certain, and it hung to his knees and was dark with weather and use. His beard was untrimmed and black, going to grey at the edges. He had a rifle across his back and an axe at his hip, and he was moving toward them with the focused, unhurried purpose of a river in spring. Quiet and enormous and absolutely certain of where it was going. He stopped 15 feet from the edge of the group. Nobody said anything. The thin man was the first to collect himself. This doesn't concern you. The big man looked at him. He didn't answer. We have a legal claim to this property, the thin man continued. His pleasant voice had developed a slight tremor. This is a civil matter. The big man's eyes moved from the thin man to Redbeard to yellow canvas, and then to her. When he looked at her, something in his expression shifted, almost too small to see, but she caught it. He was looking at her hands, at how she was holding the pitchfork. He was calculating. Then he looked back at Redbeard and said, very quietly, "Leave. One word." That was all. Redbeard's jaw tightened. And if we don't? The big man reached back and unslung the rifle with a movement so fluid it looked effortless, and rested it across his forearm, barrel pointed at the ground, and waited. Yellow canvas went for his horse. He didn't say anything, didn't look at anyone. He simply decided, in the direct and practical way of a man who had been in similar situations and understood what they meant, and he was mounted and moving before Redbeard had finished deciding. Redbeard looked at the big man for a long moment, and the big man looked back with the patience of someone who had all day and no particular objection to using it, and then Redbeard went for his horse too. The thin man stood last. He set the deed down on the porch railing, gently, almost carefully, and buttoned his coat and walked to his horse without looking at either of them. They were gone in 2 minutes. Zinnia stood in the yard with the pitchfork in her hands and watched them go, and waited until the sound of the horses faded down the river path and disappeared. Then she let out a breath that felt like it had been waiting in her chest since morning. She looked at the big man. He had already shouldered the rifle again. He was watching the river path, making sure, giving it time. "Who are you?" she said. He didn't answer immediately. That was something she would come to understand about him. Not that he was slow, but that he was deliberate. He thought before he spoke, always, and sometimes what he thought took longer than people were comfortable waiting. "Briggs," he said. "Briggs what?" He seemed to consider this. "Just Briggs. Just Briggs," she repeated. "Where did you come from?" He looked north, up toward the ridge. She had known in a vague way that someone lived up in the old Tanner claim, had seen smoke from a chimney on cold mornings, had found a deer once that had been field-dressed, with a precision that didn't come from anyone she knew. She had assumed it was a trapper working the winter season. "You've been up on the ridge," she said. He looked at her. "How long?" He thought about it. 3 years. 3 years. She lowered the pitchfork finally. Her arms ached. She hadn't realized until now how hard she'd been gripping it. "And you've never come down? Didn't need to. What made you come down today?" He looked at the river path, then back at her. "Saw them on the water yesterday. Moving slow, looking." She understood. He had known, before she had known. Had come down from the ridge and waited in the trees and said nothing. Had waited to see if the situation would resolve itself. And when it hadn't, he had resolved it. "I had it handled," she said, because she needed to say it. He looked at the pitchfork in her hands. He didn't say anything. "I did," she said. 3-1, he said. "I'm aware of the odds." He nodded almost to himself and looked north again. He was preparing to leave. She could feel it, the way you can feel a conversation winding toward its end. "They'll come back," she said. He stopped. "That man, the thin one." He mentioned Silas Croft. "I know that name." She had heard it in Dunmore, on one of her last trips in, before the winter had closed the roads. Croft was a land agent working out of the county seat, and what he worked toward was acquiring homesteads from settlers who couldn't prove their claims. Widows, orphans, anyone who had lost the person who filed the original paperwork. He had the county registrar in his pocket, people said. He had patience and lawyers, and the particular confidence of a man who had never lost a dispute he started. "He won't stop with one visit," she said. "He'll come back with paperwork, or he'll come back with more men." Briggs was quiet for a long moment. The wind came down from the ridge and moved through the Douglas firs, and somewhere in the north field one of her goats made a sound of protest at the cold. "You have the deed?" he said. "Yes. Original filing, in the county records. My father filed it himself, 1871. He turned back from the tree line and looked at the house, actually looked at it, at the roof, at the foundation, at the woodpile that was lower than it should be for November. He was assessing. She didn't know whether to find that comforting or presumptuous. "Your father," he said. "He taught you to use that?" He nodded at the pitchfork. "He taught me to use everything we had," she said. "He taught me a pitchfork wasn't a weapon." "No," Briggs agreed. "It's not, but it was what I had." Yes. Something passed between them then. Not words, not quite understanding, but the beginning of it. She had spent 11 months being capable, because she had to be, because there was no other option, and she had been alone in that capability, in a way that was its own kind of exhaustion. And this man was looking at her not with pity, which she couldn't have borne, and not with the particular condescension she'd gotten from the men in Dunmore who wondered, aloud and without apology, what she planned to do with the place. He was looking at her, the way you look at something you respect. "Come inside," she said. "I'll make coffee." He looked surprised. It was the first time his expression had changed into something she could read clearly, and it surprised her in turn. That surprise was possible for him. "Just coffee," she said, "and I want to know about those men, what you saw on the river." He came inside. His hands, she noticed, were extraordinary, not in any romantic sense, in the purely practical sense that they were the hands of a man who worked constantly with them, calloused and scarred, and missing the tip of one finger on his left hand, though he moved that hand without any apparent accommodation for its absence. He held the tin coffee cup like a thing of value, and drank slowly and told her, in his deliberate way, what he had seen. 3 men, a flat-bottomed boat, moving up the Callaway 2 days ago. They had stopped at the Pritchard place, empty since old Amos Pritchard had died in September. No heirs anyone knew of. They had gone inside and come out an hour later and made marks on a paper one of them was carrying. Then they had moved upriver. "They're surveying," Zinnia said. Briggs nodded. "Croft's people, looking for unclaimed land or land they can make unclaimed." She wrapped her hands around her own cup. "How many other places did they stop at?" 2, between the Pritchard place and here." She thought about her neighbors, her near neighbors, which in this country meant anyone within 8 miles. The Fenway family, 2 miles south. Old Hector Vane, who had the place with the collapsed barn that he kept meaning to fix. Were they home? Did they know? "I need to warn them," she said. Briggs looked at her. "The Fenways, Hector Vane. If Croft's men are working their way up the river, they're next. The road's iced over south of the creek." "I know. I'll go through the high meadow." She was already calculating. The high meadow was longer but passable. She'd done it in worse conditions. "Can you stay here?" "Just for the day, in case they come back while I'm gone." He didn't answer immediately. She watched him think it through, whatever he was thinking through. She had already learned that he didn't speak until he'd finished thinking, and interrupting him would only start the process over. "I'll stay," he said. She got up and got her coat and her rifle. "Take the Winchester," she said, setting it on the table in front of him. "It's better than the one you've got." He looked at the rifle. At her. "I know it is," she said. "My father kept it clean, or rather said, 'Miss.'" She was at the door when he said her name. And stopped. She turned. "Zinnia," she said. "Zinnia." He said it once, learning it. "Be back before dark." "I intend to be." She went. The high meadow was harder than she'd expected. The ice came up through the grass in sheets, hidden under a thin layer of snow that looked solid and wasn't, and she went through it twice. Not badly, just enough to soak the left side of her coat and remind her that the body's warmth is a resource, finite, to be managed. She'd grown up knowing this, her father's voice in her ear. "Don't fight the cold, work with it, keep moving, eat something." She ate half the biscuit she'd put in her pocket and kept moving. The Fenways were home. Marlene Fenway came to the door before Zinnia had finished knocking, which told her Marlene had been watching out the window, which told her Marlene had already seen something that made her watchful. Zinnia told her about the men, about the boat, about Silas Croft. Marlene's face went through several expressions in quick succession and settled on the one Zinnia recognized from her own mirror. The look of a woman calculating what she can afford to fight and what it will cost her. "We have our papers," Marlene said. "Theodore filed them proper." "So did my father," Zinnia said. "That didn't stop them from walking into my house." Marlene was quiet. "Get your papers somewhere they can't be taken," Zinnia said, "and get word to Dunmore if you can. The county records. If Croft has the registrar in his pocket, we need someone looking at those books who doesn't work for him." Marlene nodded. "And you? What are you going to do?" "Go warn Hector Vane. Then go home." "You're alone up there," Marlene said. "Not an accusation, just a fact." "Not entirely," Zinnia said. She couldn't explain it better than that, not quickly, and she needed to move before the light changed. Hector Vane was harder to find. He was in his barn when she got there, and it took 10 minutes of knocking and calling before he emerged, suspicious and slow, smelling of whiskey and wood smoke. She told him what she'd told the Fenways. He listened with the particular expression of a man who has been told bad news so many times that it has lost the capacity to surprise him. "Croft," he said. "Yeah, I know that name. What do you know?" "He's been in Dunmore 3 weeks, staying at the hotel, eating in the dining room, very respectable." Hector's voice made the word sound like something unclean. "Word is he's got a letter from the county seat authorizing him to act as a claims adjudicator, whatever that means." It meant he had paperwork. It meant he had a title, even if the title was invented, which gave him standing to act before anyone could stop him. "There's a land attorney in Millfield," Hector said, "fellow named Weston. He's been fighting Croft's people for 2 years over the Rucker place. He hasn't won yet, but he's still fighting." Zinnia filed that name away. She was back at the homestead before dark. Barely, the last light failing as she came through the tree line and saw the glow in her window. The sight of it stopped her for a moment. She had not seen light in her window from the outside in 11 months, had not had the experience of coming home to a place that looked inhabited, looked warm, looked like someone was waiting. She went inside. Briggs was at the table. He had fed the animals. She could tell by the quiet from the barn, and replenished the wood box, and she could smell something on the stove that was not the coffee from that morning. He had cooked. He looked up when she came in. "Before dark," she said. He nodded. She took off her coat and hung it by the door, and went to the stove and looked at what was in the pot. It was a stew, rough but real. He had found the smoked venison in the larder, and the dried beans and the last of the carrots from the root cellar, and made something that smelled like the best thing she'd encountered in recent memory. "You didn't have to do this," she said. He didn't answer. She had started to understand that silence, with him, was not absence. It was presence, the kind that didn't need to fill itself with words. She told him about Weston in Millfield while they ate. She told him about the letter Croft was carrying, the authorization, the implication that the county had already been maneuvered into position. He listened the way he did everything, with his full attention, without interruption. "Millfield is 4 days in this weather," he said, when she finished. "I know, you can't leave the property for 4 days. I know that too." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind had picked up and was working at the northwest corner of the house, the corner with the worst leak. She had a bucket there. "I'll go," he said. She looked up. "To Millfield. Find Weston." He said it the way he said everything. Not as an offer, not as a question, a statement of what was going to happen. "I know the winter routes. I can do it in 2.5 days, and leave here unguarded." "You can guard it. With a pitchfork, with a Winchester," he said. "And you know how to use it." She did. She had shot her first deer at 14, and hadn't missed often since. She looked at this man across her father's table, in her father's chair, eating from her father's bowl, and she thought about 11 months of solitude, and the weight of it, and she thought about how the thin man had held the deed like it meant nothing. "Why?" she said. He looked at her. "Why would you do that? You don't know me. This isn't your fight." He was quiet for a long time, long enough that the stove popped and settled, and the wind gusted hard and rattled the window in its frame. "It's the right thing," he said finally. She wanted to press him, wanted to ask if he understood that she couldn't pay him, couldn't promise him anything, that she was a woman alone, with a disputed claim and a leaking roof and 2 goats and a Winchester. But she looked at his face and understood that none of that was what he was weighing. He wasn't calculating what he'd get out of it. He was simply looking at a thing that needed doing and deciding to do it. She had spent her whole life watching her father make decisions that way. "All right," she said. He left at first light. She stood on the porch and watched him go, up toward the ridge, moving through the snow without apparent effort, his elk-hide coat dark against the pale morning. He didn't look back. She hadn't expected him to. She went inside and picked up the Winchester and checked the action and loaded it and set it beside the door. Then she went and did her chores. The thin man came back on the third day. He came alone this time, which surprised her. Then she understood. He was not here to threaten. He was here to negotiate. She met him at the porch steps with the Winchester at her shoulder. He stopped at the edge of the yard. In daylight, without his associates, he looked smaller than she remembered. More ordinary, a man in a too-clean coat, doing a job he'd been paid to do. "I have an offer," he said, "from Mr. Croft, $30 and safe passage to Dunmore. Very reasonable, considering—" "No," Zinnia said. "Miss, my father built this house. He cleared this land. He filed on it legal and proper, and paid his taxes for 18 years, and I have the receipts to prove it." She kept the rifle where it was. Her father's rifle, which she knew by weight and breath and long familiarity. "I am not leaving. I am not negotiating. And you are going to go back to Silas Croft and tell him that Weston in Millfield has been contacted, and that the county records are going to be examined by someone he doesn't own." The thin man's pleasant expression flickered. That was when she knew Hector's information had been right. Croft was doing something with those records, and he knew it was vulnerable. "You should think carefully," the thin man said. "I have been thinking carefully," Zinnia said, "for 11 months. Now get off my land." He got off her land. She stood on the porch until he was out of sight, and then she sat down on the top step and let her hands shake, finally, which they hadn't done while he was there. Just a minute of it. Then she stood back up and went inside. Briggs came back on the 4th day, not the 3rd. She had tried not to count, tried not to watch the tree line, tried to conduct herself with the equanimity she felt was appropriate, and had failed at all 3. He came out of the timber in the late afternoon. And he was not alone. The man with him was small and precise, with a leather satchel and boots unsuited for the terrain and the look of someone who had been dragged through wilderness, against his better judgment and intended to remember it. Weston, she assumed. She had the door open before they reached the porch. "He's real," Briggs said by way of introduction. Weston, it was Weston, looked somewhat offended and somewhat amused and introduced himself properly. He had, he said, spent the better part of 2 days reviewing what he could learn about Silas Croft from the sources available to him, and he had found what he had suspected he would find. A pattern. Croft had been doing this up and down the river valley for 3 years, targeting properties where the original filer was dead, and the heir was a single woman or an elderly man with no access to legal resources. He had a relationship with the county registrar that was, at minimum, irregular. "I can't promise a quick resolution," Weston said. He was drinking her coffee at her table, thawing his feet at her stove. "But I can promise a fight, and I believe, that we have the better case." "What do you need from me?" Zinnia asked. "Every piece of paper in that tobacco tin, the original deed, the tax receipts, anything your father put in writing." She went and got the tin. Weston stayed 2 nights and left on a clear morning with her papers, copies made and witnessed. The originals locked in a strong box he'd carried in his satchel, with the somewhat battered dignity of a man who had learned never to travel without one. He had left her with a copy of every document and a name at the county seat, a clerk who was not Croft's man and could be reached if things moved quickly. She stood on the porch and watched him go. Briggs was beside her. He had said almost nothing during Weston's visit, had fed the animals, fixed the leak in the northwest corner with a competence that suggested he had built things before, replenished the woodpile to a level it hadn't reached. Since her father was alive, he had occupied the homestead the way weather occupies a landscape. Without announcement, without asking permission, simply by being thoroughly and practically present. "Thank you," she said. He looked out at the river. The current had gone back to running east, the way it should. "They'll still come back," he said. "Croft doesn't give up easily." I know. She had accepted that. It was not the end, it was the beginning of a longer fight, a legal fight. The kind that exhausted you differently than a physical one, but exhausted you just the same. But now I'm not fighting it alone. He didn't respond to that. She hadn't expected him to. She'd said it as much to herself as to him. A thing she needed to hear in her own voice. That it was true. She looked sideways at him. He was still watching the river. "The ridge is north," she said. "Yes, you should go back. Before the weather turns." He turned to look at her then, full on, the way he rarely did, direct in a way that took some getting used to. He looked at her for a long moment in the way he looked at everything. Not judging, not calculating, simply seeing. "I'll stay until spring," he said. "Make sure Croft's men don't come back before Weston has time to work." She should have objected. She had 11 months of practice at not needing anyone, at the particular pride that lives in self-sufficiency, at the knowledge that dependence was a debt, and debts had a way of compounding. She should have said she was fine, that she had the Winchester, that she'd managed before he came down from the ridge. Instead, she said, "There's room in the barn." And he nodded as if that settled it, and went to get his things. She stood on the porch alone for a moment before she went inside. The wind came down from the ridge, cold and clean, and moved through the Douglas firs, and the river ran east the way it was supposed to. And for the first time in 11 months, the homestead did not feel like something she was defending from the world. It felt like somewhere she might actually stay.